Alrighty. I'm going to give you guys some of the highlights from the sections you should have read for this week. So he's kind of go along with it. This is not all the information, so don't just watch this video and be like, I don't have to read the pages. That won't work very well. First section was about the geography of Europe. This is Europe. Okay. Look at how European it is. Right. You can kind of see, England, the United Kingdom, Ireland. These are areas that are islands. They're surrounded by water. Okay. Very different than the mainland, right? Italy, where Rome used to be, France, where the Gallic barbarians used to live. These areas have these mountain ranges like the Alps, right? The Apennines are over here. Here's all the mountains of Greece. So you have a lot of mountainous areas. In the center area, Spain, very mountainous, right? That shapes sort of a little bit how, people have developed here and there. This Charlemagne guy, though, we're going to talk a lot about Charlemagne. Interesting fella. Has an odd sort of history behind him. So in some ways, Charlemagne is he's a very powerful leader. Comes out of France, which was technically separated into like 4 sections, and Charlemagne makes a name for himself pretty quickly and becomes a very, very powerful figure. Some of the things that were unique about him: he had kind of a mobile capital. His capital city, his advisors, all of his people, they were not stationary. They kind of traveled around his lands. So it was in one way a logistical nightmare, because you have to like constantly sort of figure out where in France or where in his empire he's at. But a big benefit of that is if you are a average Joe person, you might never see your king, right, at all in your entire life. But here, he might come to you. He might roll through your town one day with this caravan of people and advisors, and that made him in a lot of ways a little more approachable. But famously, Charlemagne was named a Holy Roman Emperor, right? This is the famous crowning ceremony. It took place on a Christmas day. According to the story, the Pope at the time invited Charlemagne to go there. And according to Charlemagne, this was a surprise. He had no idea. Pope asked him to go there for a Christmas ceremony. He shows up, and like the Pope asks him to kneel in front of these thousands of people that are there. In this picture, there's like literally 6 people. There's a lot more than that. And while the Pope's talking, he says that there's this king. This is a king who fights for the Catholic Church and the Christian faith, and puts a crown on his head and names him the Holy Roman Emperor. Charlemagne says that was a complete surprise. He had no idea that was coming. What I'm going to tell you is, if you are named a Holy Roman Emperor, the guy probably runs it by you before he does it. Probably doesn't just drop that on you as a surprise for Christmas, right? But Charlemagne has always talked about how this crowning ceremony left him conflicted. He wasn't necessarily happy about it. And this is where I wish that we could be in class to really talk about this, because there's a lot of discussion we could have around this. But think about why he might not be happy with being crowned emperor by this Pope, and what we would get to eventually if we had a nice discussion. Imagine for a second that we just had a great discussion with all sorts of amazing ideas. You did a really good job. It was a good one. But the main point behind it is this. Charlemagne's issue with being named Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope is that because the Pope did it, it kind of means the Pope has the power to do it. You know what I mean? Which means that the Pope could take this away from him. The Pope could name someone else Holy Roman Emperor. So Charlemagne, who's supposed to be like this great, big, powerful leader, now is like a great, big, powerful leader, except to one guy who's above him. And that kind of didn't make him feel real well. So it didn't sit well with him that, you get to be Holy Roman Emperor, and, you get to, rule this great, big empire, but there's still a guy who's more powerful than you, right? There's still a guy who gave it to you. You kind of owe it to him. And the Holy Roman Empire is a real weird thing. Like I've talked about before, it's not really holy, and it's not even Roman, and it's definitely not an empire. The closest it ever became to one was during Charlemagne. He was one of the more powerful leaders. What you'll find over the majority of the Holy Roman Empire is that you have very weak emperors that are emperors in name only. They don't have great big empires they rule. A lot of times it's like the entirety of maybe the country of Germany. And if you look at it, let's see if I have a picture real quick. Sometimes you'll see these maps of it. Here's one. Listen, I'm not going to edit any of this, so you're just going to have to deal with me looking. So here's like the Holy Roman Empire in German, but you see all of these different little teeny tiny countries. That's the problem, right? Because each of these areas had their own rulers, and none of them really listened to the Holy Roman Emperor. So a lot of times this is like the country of Germany is really like 100 to 200 miniature countries. And that's kind of what feudalism is all about in the Middle Ages of Europe, is you don't have any strong kings that can rule over all these people. After Charlemagne dies, it kind of falls apart very quickly. And you have sort of these Holy Roman emperors that have very little authority and power, right? And so they're not able to maintain order in these areas. And that sort of brings me to, Section 3 talks about feudal life in these manors, right? What it's like to live in these small villages. You turn to local rulers for protection. At sort of the height of feudalism, there are things that said that the king of Paris, was unable to rule 3 miles outside of Paris. That he had no authority within 3 miles of Paris. No one listened to him. Are you even barely a king at that point? You can't rule anywhere outside your city. I mean, that's sort of a pretty big evidence of someone who's not a powerful leader, right? So if you had trouble, there was invaders coming, or, you wanted a dispute solved, you didn't bother going to the king. What's he going to do? You went to local rich people who were in charge. And that's where like that manor life came from. You sort of have like these independent villages that act like individual little countries, where you have like the rich lord of the manor who, provides protection for people who live under his land, provides military protection, but also is like the law and order of that area. And that's a big deal for those local people, and that's why feudalism lasted for a while, right? Because these rich people had that authority. And that goes hand in hand with knights, right? Similar to samurai in Japan that work for the daimyo. The knights kind of work for these local lords. These are people who get land in exchange for helping to fight and protect, the people of their manor. And the knights are definitely an interesting group. The samurai had bushido, right? That code they're supposed to follow. The knights have sort of this code called chivalry, this idea of fighting honorably. There's a lot of similarities between knights in Europe and samurai in Japan. Now, they're not as driven by their code as samurai to the point where they commit any ritual suicide like seppuku, right? They don't do that. But, there is a high amount of honor and fighting honorably, and, not cheating in combat. And these sorts of things are things that samurai, knights value. And it's definitely a very interesting way of life. So feudalism has some benefits and some downsides. In some ways, life in these manors and these local lords is nice because your leader, the person you listen to, is someone you might see daily. You might be able to interact with them as much as you want. It's definitely not a bad deal if you're a knight, because in all that heavy armor, fighting while violent at times, you're more protected than at other points in history when you're fighting, right? You are wearing these big giant suits of armor. It does lead to some interesting things, like when you look at sort of the weaponry they use, like those great big claymore swords that, they have found pictures of knights actually fighting, holding them the wrong way, like holding the blade in their like gloved hands, and then like the sword that has like the hilt, right? Using it like a hammer, like swinging that down on people because of the armor they're wearing. Knights would have people called squires that would help them to put their armor on and train under them, and eventually, if they do well, eventually become knights themselves. That sort of class of people did pretty well. Peasant life in the manor, not so good. If you're a peasant, someone who works these farmlands, it is a very demanding job. Peasants are expected in the manor to work long hours. They worked usually 6 days a week. In some cases, you're going to have it's almost like an economic version of slavery. These peasants are expected to work for the lords of the manor in exchange for being allowed to stay there. But they're not. In a lot of cases, they're not paid to do so. In some of these cases, you'll have peasants working like 4 days a week for their local lord, and then the other 2 days they're going to work like outside jobs to get money so they can like buy food and things for their family. And then Sunday is usually a break day. So the Catholic religion was real big in the Middle Ages for one reason. Even if you weren't religious, you kind of liked it because you at least got religious holidays off. So there were peasants who maybe didn't necessarily consider themselves very Christian, but at least pretended to be, because at least you got Sundays off, and at least you got, Christmas and other holidays to celebrate. And so there's that sort of growth as well. In some cases, like, peasants weren't even allowed to like marry without permission of their lord. It's almost like a life debt you could never pay back. And so depending on who you're working for, that could be a pretty unpleasant experience. It's not as bad as slavery in some ways. They're not necessarily seen as property, but there are some pretty bad deals for some of these peasants. And, that is some of the drawbacks of feudalism. And it'll take a long time for it to come to an end, but, these local rulers, it's weird to think like they're almost more powerful than kings and emperors, at least within their villages, right? Because they have the money, they own all the land, right? These peasants don't own the land they're on. They're essentially renting it. The knights are given land, but they're still basically at the mercy of these lords because they've got to get, their food and stuff provided for them, and, better deal than a peasant, but still, the way it is. And, that system, that sort of feudalism is definitely a unique thing. Obviously, it eventually comes to an end. We'll get to that sort of later on, but that's the sort of mindset. So when we talk about things that are happening in the Middle Ages, you have to kind of think, individual villages more so than great big kingdoms, right? With the exception of people like Charlemagne, who, like I said, is kind of a rarity. You're not going to have rulers that are that strong. So there's sort of a little bit of a highlight rundown and try to keep it short. If you have not yet corrected your OpenNote / book test, please make sure that you do so. You have chapter review for this chapter that is due on Friday. Make sure you get that done. Yeah, grades should be up to date. I think I have everything in that's been turned into me. Keep up the good work. Most of you are doing well. Sucks that we're not in class. This is not the ideal way to learn this information, and what can I say? Stay safe, stay healthy. Peace out, dog.